I think if there's one thing that all photographers have in common, it's that desire to improve, to take better images, images that convey more emotion or tell better stories, or even evoke a greater reaction. And in this video, what I want to do is to share some of the strategies that I use to improve my own photography. As photographers, if we're looking to improve our photography, I think it's really important that we understand our strengths and weaknesses, what we're good at and what we're not so good at. And that way we can build upon the good stuff and put strategies in place that help us to improve the bad stuff, the stuff we're not particularly good at. And the key to understanding what our strengths and weaknesses are is improving our self-awareness. Self-awareness is essentially that ability to reflect on our own behaviour in an objective way. People that are self-aware can generally compare their behaviour to their own set of values and beliefs. And when that behaviour meets those values, then we get a sense of pride. And when it doesn't, that's generally the trigger to behave differently in future. In the context of photography, self-awareness generally involves two things. Firstly, having an understanding of what you believe makes a really good photo. And secondly, the ability to assess your own work against those beliefs. If you have those two things, then working out which areas you need to improve is pretty straightforward. Of course, it is possible to develop as a photographer without a sense of self-awareness. If you take enough photographs over a long enough period of time, eventually your images will start to improve subconsciously. And while that can be a really satisfying way of learning, it can also be pretty slow. And that leads to a lot of frustration and in some cases disillusionment. I believe the first step to greater self-awareness is understanding what you believe makes a good photograph. Now that's going to differ from person to person, but it's that subjectiveness that makes photography fascinating. What we believe makes a good photograph is going to have the biggest impact on the quality of our work. And it's also possible for our beliefs to change over time as we mature as photographers. If we want to develop our beliefs, it's simply a case of being more conscious about what we like in a photograph and what we don't. If we take a collection of images like a social media feed or a book, when we're going through that, we're constantly making decisions about the images that we like and the images that we don't. And growing our beliefs is simply a case of identifying what we like about an image. And if we do that for enough photographs, patterns start to form. In order to illustrate that point, let me explain some of the beliefs that I have built up over the years. Now, the first one is that all images should have a primary subject that kind of acts as a protagonist in our story. The second thing is that the image should be composed in such a way as to provide a context that, when combined with the subject, creates the narrative. And the final thing is that the conditions around the photograph should add to that narrative by creating some form of mood. Now those beliefs are very personal to me, and they're more than likely going to be completely different to your own beliefs. Now I would never impose my beliefs on anyone else. I am aware that different is not necessarily wrong. However, it does impact how I assess other people's images and whether I like their work or not. Once we understand our own personal beliefs about what makes a good photograph, self-awareness comes from that ability to compare our images to our beliefs. It's simply a case of asking ourselves the question, do my images match what I think it makes a good photograph? And now, why our personal beliefs are completely subjective, the assessment of our images is objective. They either do match our beliefs or they don't. Stepping back from photography for a moment, one of the things that I'm really good at is solving quite complex problems by simplifying them. And this is something that I used to use to great effect in my previous career before I became a full-time photographer. Unfortunately, I also have a tendency to oversimplify problems, particularly when it comes to people's motivations and emotions. And if this approach has one drawback, it's just how difficult it can be at times to rationalise what you like about a photograph. Now, in order to illustrate how developing a greater sense of self-awareness can help us to improve our photography, I'm now going to look back and review 3 of my own images. But before I start, I should just mention, at this point in my development, there are 3 things that I really take for granted about my images. And that is that they are correctly exposed, they are correctly focused, and they're processed in such a way that is complementary and subtle. Now, if I don't get those 3 things right, and believe you me, by now I should be nailing that every time, then I just reject the image and I don't assess it any further. Okay, so first up is this image taken from Side Pike near Bleed Tarn back in November. The primary subject is the Langdale Pikes. It's this impressive rock structure, probably one of the most impressive in the whole of the Lake District. And the composition shows the valley floor below, and it provides a sense of scale and a sense of grandeur, and just shows just how impressive the Langdale Pikes really are. What I don't like about this image is the lighting. There just isn't enough light on the pikes themselves, not enough to show them off at their very best. Next up is this shot taken on Hallin Fell in October, and it features the obelisk that sits on the summit. And this is a fantastic example of the workmanship that goes into some of the summit cairns that sit on top of our fells. The composition shows Ullswater below, and the story that it tells is that this fantastic structure isn't on top of Hallin Fell because of its prominence, because it's barely 400 metres high. In fact, that's there because of this wonderful view, and where Hallin Fell sits right next to Ullswater. What I don't like about this image is the light. Now, firstly, it's coming from behind the cairn, which is in exactly the wrong location. It also doesn't meet or match the grandeur of that cairn and that fantastic view. The final image that I want to look at is this one of the Haweswater Reservoir that featured in my last video. Now, the primary subject is this derelict cottage, and the composition shows how it sits in the landscape next to the reservoir. For me, this is quite a sad image, and I think that there's a story here that connects the derelict cottage to the reservoir. You see, the reservoir was created by flooding a valley that essentially wiped out the village of Mardale Green. And again, this is where the problem is with the light and the conditions. It's quite bright, and I think that this is such a sad story. What it actually needs is far more moody, sombre conditions. Having assessed these 3 images, we can see that there's a pattern starting to form. Now, in each case, I've worked really hard to identify a strong subject and to fine-tune the composition so that it tells an interesting story. Unfortunately, in each case, I have failed to get the right conditions that convey the appropriate mood. And this is the area that I need to focus on in order to improve my photography. Having now completed an honest appraisal of my images, I can now start to build a strategy that builds on my strengths and focuses in on improving my weaknesses. I need to be able to get not just to the right place, but also to the right time. Now, how I go about doing that is a subject for a whole different video entirely. So that's how we can grow self-awareness around our photography, and how by doing so can help us to identify our strengths and our weaknesses. Once we understand what we're good at and what we're not so good at, we can put together a plan that will allow us to focus in on the aspects that need attention. Now, if you would like to discuss any of the points raised in this video, please remember that I am available for mentoring sessions over Skype.